On her knees on the floor, she prayed, howled, and wailed, held her blood-covered hands up to the sky and screamed, "Why?"
Hey everybody, Symphony MONSTRO Tano here with a fucking tier list of Crash Bandicoot games. I haven't made videos in a while and wanted to put something out, so here we go. Also, don't mind me, I've just got my fursuit on. Anyways, I've reviewed all these games before, in my opinion, quite badly. I've spoken about those videos, so I won't get too into it. I don't agree at all with a lot of what I said in those old videos, and even since the commentary videos, my opinions have changed slightly. So hopefully this video will just totally set the record straight and get those of you that care up to speed with my current opinions of these games. I'll be taking a look at Crash 1, Crash 2, Warped, Wrath of Cortex, Twinsanity, Titans, Mind Over Mutant, and Insane Trilogy. So basically the 7 main games in the series with Insane Trilogy tacked on top. I've got a few reasons for this. If you're wondering why insert game here wasn't included on the list, it's likely for one of the following reasons. 1, I don't really think I can or should compare them to platformers. 2, I don't really know where I stand with them. 3, I haven't played them. Or 4, the last category, which I like to call because who fucking cares? I'll just be covering the games in order of release, it's just a bit easier for me to do it that way. Lastly, this list is completely based around my opinion. I make no attempt to state facts or to be objective, as though such a thing could even be possible. If you disagree, let me know what you think in the comments. If you hate a game I love or love a game I hate, leave your thoughts in the comments below. Or don't, I don't really give a shit. Lastly, and you can skip this part if you like, a brief little guide to this legend. What I mean specifically when I say a game fits in a certain tier. S-tier games are like the Big Lunch Edition. These are the masterpieces that everybody should play. For example, I think Half-Life is absolutely amazing and legendary, and is a game that any fan of first-person shooters should play. It is a legendary game, and that is deserving of S-tier. A-tier games aren't quite as legendary, but they're still incredibly well-constructed, solid experiences. They are games that are great in their own right. I'd say that SpongeBob Battle for Bikini Bottom is an A-tier game. It isn't perfect by any means, but it holds up extremely well, better than the hideous remake, that's for sure. B-tier games are still good games, but they do have problems that hold them back a little bit. Little things that mean I don't revisit them quite as much as I could. I think Mass Effect is a B-tier game. The story and world building in ME1 are absolutely phenomenal, but the gunplay takes some getting used to, and there's some shit I dread playing, like any of the Mako sections. Still a good game nonetheless. C-tier games are games that I ultimately think are not worth playing, but aren't explicitly terrible or even bad. If B-tier games were a 60-40 split between good and bad, C-tier games are a 40-60 split between good and bad. They have redeeming qualities, but are ultimately bogged down by the elements that make them bad. I'd say Shantae Half Genie Hero is a C-tier game. Not terrible by any means. In fact, it's not too hard to think of how the game could be tidied up. It's got a lot of potential and elements that are good, but ultimately too much of its potential just goes unrealized in the finished product. D-tier games, on the other hand, are just straight up crap. These are the games that just don't live up to their potential at all and barely have any potential to begin with. Unlike C-tier games, if you tried to fix these games, they'd be almost unrecognizable. They have major problems inherent to their very design. Kingdom Hearts Birth by Sleep is a solid D-tier game. Just really bad. Not the worst thing of all time, but extremely shallow and uninteresting. F-tier games are what I like to call the you've failed at life tier. These are all hot fucking garbage, completely irredeemable trash. Shadow the Hedgehog is a shining example of an F-tier game, a game that is just completely fucked by design. You cannot do anything to this game to save it. Similarly to how S-tier games are legendarily good, F-tier games are legendarily bad. In Shadow's case, it irreparably destroyed Sonic's reputation and set the foundation for what would be the series' magnum opus of trash games. So now when I say a game fits into blank tier, you know what I mean. Now let's get on with the tier list. So starting off strong with Crash 1, I actually think very highly of this game. I don't think it's too uncommon to see games suffer from first game syndrome to the point where they're completely eclipsed by their stronger, better, faster, younger brothers. Guitar Hero is an excellent example of this sort of game. It would be completely overshadowed by Guitar Hero 2 and Guitar Hero 3 especially. Have you tried playing Guitar Hero 1 recently? I have. It's fucking terrible. Crash Bandicoot is not one of those games at all. Let's not get it twisted. Crash 1 has indisputably aged. The archaic save system and controls are the most commonly cited issues by fans. These bother me too, but having played the game for many years, I'm willing to look past them, and what I'm left with is, in my opinion, one of the greatest platformers of all time. This game had a huge influence on the industry that cannot be overstated, enough that I'd say pretty much any highly linear 3D platformer owes its success to Sonic's ass game. Mechanically, the game is not really special. In fact, it's almost bad at times, but the presentation side of the game is insanely good. Crash 1 fully embodies everything great about the old PlayStation aesthetic. The game's atmosphere is still amazing today. I'll never get tired of exploring these blocky jungles and temples. Everything from those crunchy PS1 textures to the lighting that's cleverly baked into the textures, to Josh Mansell's phenomenal score, it all just comes together to form something truly magical in my eyes. We haven't even gotten into Crash himself, he just looks so incredibly dynamic in every single pose. I could watch the idle animation of him throwing a Wumpa Fruit in the air all day. You know, not too long ago I played a licensed PS1 game that I remember playing a lot when I was little, Monsters Inc. Scream Team, and let me just say that, you learn to really appreciate the level of ingenuity Naughty Dog was working at when you see someone that clearly wasn't doing that. So, yeah. There's so much about this game's aesthetic that I absolutely love. I could talk about it all day, but I'll spare you. All you need to know is that I consider this game to be an extremely solid S tier. Like I said, the game has indisputably aged and can feel kind of cumbersome to come back to, but if you're willing to meet it halfway, what you're left with is an incredibly engrossing experience. Way more interesting than whatever horseshit Naughty Dog is putting out nowadays, that's for sure. Sure, mechanically it's kinda lacking, but to put it any lower than S tier would be a tremendous disservice to the size of its sphere of influence, let's say. Anyways, next game. So I happen to think very highly of Crash 2 as well. Crash 2 features many quality of life improvements over Crash 1, such as improved saving, easier gems, and most importantly, the improved controls. Crash's controls are much tighter, but he isn't totally weightless. In my opinion, the improved controls have helped Crash 2 age much better than its older brother. Aesthetically, Crash 2 has aged exceptionally well, which is no surprise given how Naughty Dog had already mastered the tech with Crash 1. Crash 2 sees Crash going to all sorts of environments. All the different environments Crash goes to can make the game feel a little disjointed and lacking the same cohesion of Crash 1, but Crash 2 has a lot of little details that help tie everything together. The frozen over sculptures in Snow-Go, the different entrance and exit portals, the way you can see Cortex Castle in the back of Road to Ruin, or, my personal favorite detail, how you can see the islands from Crash 1 in the Secret Warp Room, a detail that is absent in Insane Trilogy for some godforsaken reason I can't understand. All of this kept in mind, I do think I prefer the aesthetic of Crash 1. Instead of partly exploring many different settings like Crash 2, Crash 1 heavily explores a few locations. It's a jack-of-all-trades, master-of-none situation. There isn't necessarily anything wrong with Crash 2's approach at all, and I'm not trying to imply that Crash 2 isn't absolutely masterful with how it explores all of its different settings. I just prefer the visual style of Crash 1. Crash 1 was darker, moodier, edgier. I prefer that style. The soundtrack reflects this as well. Crash 1's soundtrack was very percussive and noisy, while Crash 2's soundtrack, by comparison, is much more lighthearted and melodic. All of this, of course, is incredibly subjective. The reasons I love Crash 1's style may be the same reasons some of you hate it. However, if I'm being honest with myself, I think Crash 2 is a much better constructed game. I'm also putting Crash 2 in the S tier. In the list, I'm putting it below Crash 1, but that is just for convenience. I consider the games to be basically equal, with Crash 1 having art style and legacy on its side, while Crash 2 has better game feel and mechanical depth on its side. If you're someone that puts gameplay before anything else, then Crash 2 is definitely the place for you to go. Next up is Warped. Now, I'm going to quote a guy named Nova Canoe that you should absolutely check out if you like game analysis. Anyways, in his analysis of Warped, he brings up a slight physics difference with the controls. In Crash 2, if you jump and let go of the analog stick or D-pad, Crash will immediately come to a halt. It still takes Crash some time to build up speed in the air, so he can't completely change his mind mid-jump the way he can in Wrath or Twinsanity. This is a far cry from Crash 1, where Crash carried a lot of momentum through jumps, which could cause some problems. Warped actually does reintroduce a bit of momentum into Crash's jump, enough that there's a noticeable difference when compared to Crash 2, but it's not as bad as it was in Crash 1. Nova Canoe says that, while this does remedy a potential issue of Crash sometimes feeling weightless, it is ultimately a regression, because it prioritizes the aesthetic feel of the controls over what's actually more practical and useful. Two things I have to say about that is, 1, that is beautifully worded, and 2, I honestly think Crash Bandicoot Warped in its entirety is struggling with this. Rather than proper gameplay variety that tests you on a small set of mechanics, Warped features what I'd call fake gameplay variety, or variety for its own sake. Despite being a platformer, only about half of Warped is actually platforming, the other half is dedicated to a wide variety of different gameplay styles. There's some Wave Race 64 style jet skiing, there's flying around in a plane, swimming, riding on a motorcycle, and more. It clearly demonstrates that Naughty Dog were getting restless, and, to quote Nova Canoe once again, wanting to stretch their programming legs. Personally, I find the quality of these non-platforming levels to be very inconsistent. I think the Tiger levels are the best auto-run levels in the entire series hands down, and the swimming levels have grown on me over the years I've been playing this game. But then there are some that bother me. The jet ski itself isn't too bad for the first level, but you gotta do this shit like 4 times, and one of those levels, Hot Cocoa, might honestly be the worst level in the original trilogy. That is, if it weren't for the motorcycle levels, of which there are also 4, and I think the second of those levels, Road Crash, is the worst level in the original trilogy, hands down. It is just way too hard to be placed in the middle of the third warp room. I find it incredibly unpleasant to play because of the restrictive controls which just don't jive with the number of tight turns they expect you to make. But even if the controls were better and this was more fair, I still feel like it's a bit of a problem. I've been playing this game long enough that I can reliably beat this level, but even still I think to myself that I didn't sign up for this. I think it's just unfair that because they couldn't beat this incredibly challenging racing level, people couldn't continue to play the platformer they paid money for. I'd like to say that the platforming levels are so good that they make up the difference, but they have problems too. I do think that, for the most part, Crash 2 had better level design. There are some standout levels in Warped, with Boneyard and Tomb Waiter probably being my favorites, but for the most part, these levels just aren't quite as challenging as Crash 2's. And I didn't even mention the power-ups, which just feels like a massive afterthought. Warp's power-ups are entirely optional except for the few areas that explicitly tell you to use them. The Super Body Slam and Bazooka in particular are just so pointless I often forget they exist. The double jump and tornado spin in the right player's hands can completely trivialize all platforming challenge. That's one of the reasons I like Tomb Waiter, because it's the only level that continues to be challenging even with these powers. But yeah, this is what I mean when I call it fake gameplay variety. They are prioritizing the aesthetic feel of gameplay variety, rather than offering genuine challenge the way that Crash 1 and 2 did. Warped feels like the formula already established by 1 and 2 with a bunch of gimmicks slapped on top of it. The last thing I want to touch on is the relics. I made some really retarded criticism in my old videos that they don't work or some bullshit like that. To be perfectly honest, I can't really remember what I said. All I know is that it was fucking retarded and I don't agree. Just like the extra gameplay styles, I find the implementation of relics to be inconsistent. I think for most of the platforming levels, they actually work out surprisingly well. Also, the speed shoes are the only useful power-up in the game. Some of these levels were designed to be played quickly, and for the ones that weren't, it's still fun to try and work around it. To try and plan your route so that you match up with all the cycles in the level. But that in mind, fuck having to do relics on shit like Bye Bye Blimps. This shit is not fucking fun and it never was. The relics kind of feel like an afterthought, but honestly over the years I've come to really admire their inclusion. Crash games are generally pretty easy. Even Crash 1, that's right, it's easy, get good and shut up. But anyway, the games are generally easy, so I like that they're willing to entertain such a strong challenge as trying to get a platinum relic. I've actually gotten every single platinum relic in Warped, and it was one of the most gratifying and rewarding challenges I've ever completed in a video game. With that in mind, I probably will never do it again, because Road Crash can go fuck itself. I've done a lot of complaining about Warped, but in all honesty I still consider this to be a very good game despite its flaws. Visually, this game is ridiculously impressive to me. The environments this time around are much busier than Crash 2 or 1. I think the Arabian and futuristic levels are the best examples. Like, it shouldn't be fucking possible for a game on the PlayStation to be this detailed. I don't know how the hell Naughty Dog pulled it off, but it never ceases to amaze me. The platforming levels, while not quite as fun as Crash 2's, are still incredibly fun in their own right. Also, I didn't touch on the bosses. I think they are the best in the series by far. I'll be putting Warped in A tier. Still an excellent game that, despite all of its flaws, I still find myself coming back to quite often, just not quite as often as Crash 2 or 1. Wrath of Cortex, on the other hand, is pretty whack.
Don't go sneaking round the ocean floor, unless you wanna mess with me.
The best way I can think to describe this game is Crash Bandicoot run through Google Translate, and that isn't just some dig at the game's expense, I genuinely mean that. I'm sure you've all seen this before. Put a phrase into Google Translate, translate it into some inferior foreign language like Japanese, then put it back in English and observe the result. Something about it obviously isn't quite right. Now, you can tell what it's supposed to be, in fact your brain may automatically try to fill in the gaps for you, but something about this is obviously wrong. That's Wrath of Cortex. I think one of the worst things about this game is the controls. Crash is so floaty, he's just completely weightless. You can jump forward and just change your mind mid-jump completely. It leads to platforming that is totally mindless and unsatisfying. And when you get the double jump, just forget it. You know, not too long ago I was playing Warped with my brother, just taking turns on levels like we used to when we were kids. He commented on how the double jump is kinda weird in that game, like it won't come out if you try to perform it after you reach the apex of the jump, and it stalls all of your horizontal momentum. It works similarly in Jak and Daxter now that I think about it. I thought that was kind of bizarre and unnecessary, but Wrath of Cortex made me realize that those are actually very good limitations for that move to have, because Wrath's double jump completely trivializes any platforming challenge the game could have hoped to provide. Other nuances in the controls are gone. Crash's slide jump feels awkward and doesn't seem to give him any extra height. You also can't cancel a slide into a spin. It seems minor, but these were details the original games had. Why are they not here? Something about this whole thing just feels off compared to the original games. The controls aren't the only area that's lacking. The visuals here clearly weren't given the proper amount of attention they needed. I'm not about to roast Traveler's Tales over this since the technology was new at the time. They were just left in the unfortunate position of having to live up to Naughty Dog's insanely high standards. Hopefully this puts into perspective just how impressive Crash 1 was, since the PS1 was as new to Naughty Dog during that game's development as the PS2 was to Traveler's Tales during this game's development. One of those games holds up extraordinarily well, while the other not so much. At any rate, funny-looking trees are something I'm willing to forgive. However, it does still seem like some details are missing. Shit is just not quite right. Perhaps it's best I just show you. What happens in Crash 2 or Warped when Crash returns to the Warp Room? You see the Warp Room. Crash emerges from the portal, and he takes center stage. Then he slowly pulls out the crystal and emphatically jumps in the air while his face contorts into this amazing expression. Then he does that iconic dance. But what happens in Wrath of Cortex? The camera is zoomed way the hell out, Crash is off to the right or left, just completely out of focus. Crash quickly pulls the items out like he's trying to get this over with, then he flaccidly jumps in place. No expression, no dance. The original games were filled with these little moments, and they're just totally absent in Wrath of Cortex. Mechanically, the game is not very impressive either. Wrath of Cortex doubles down on the fake gameplay variety I complained about in Warped. It ends up feeling like Warped with gimmicks stacked on top of it. Warped by itself felt like Crash 2 with gimmicks stacked on top of it, so Wrath is gimmicks on gimmicks. With a few very infamous exceptions, I don't think any of the extra gameplay styles are actually terrible. In fact, I actually think the swimming controls are better here than they were in Warped, and I like the atmosphere in theory, not so much execution, but at least they tried. But no, again, keeping some glaring exceptions in mind, I don't think they're terrible, but they are boring. I think the worst thing about this game is just how it adds literally nothing to the formula established by Crash 2 and Warped. Literally fucking nothing. I mean, the game doesn't even have autosaving, you know, that thing that Spyro 2 had, that thing that was kind of standard at this point? Wrath of Cortex just plays it so incredibly safe. Was it always like this? Well, actually no. John Burton of Traveler's Tales explains that there was much more planned for this game, but most of it didn't make the cut. It seems like the team realized that they wouldn't be finished on time if they tried to implement everything, so scaled things back and played it safe so that the game would resemble a finished product when it came time to release it. I can really respect that. I do not hold a grudge towards Traveler's Tales for the game ending up the way it did, but that comforting thought doesn't make the game any more fun to play. There are actually a few things I really do admire about Wrath of Cortex. I think some of the level themes are actually really cool, like all of the different laboratory levels, how you start out in some vehicle like the minecart or sub and are slowly breaking your way into the facility. It's pretty cool and seems to be one of the ideas that survived from when the game was being pitched as Crash Bandicoot Worlds. I think one of my favorite levels in the game is Tsunami. You play as Coco being chased by a giant tsunami wave. If you have the blue gem, you unlock a secret path which has you going back to platform across the wreckage. I think that is so cool. I really wish the game had more of this. And also, I really like Crash and Burn. Unlike basically every other level in the game, I actually find this level to be pretty visually impressive. Judging by all of the prototype footage, it seems like this was one of the first levels to be made for the game, and it seems like they spent the most time on it. I think it shows. As far as level themes goes, that's really it, sadly. I find most of the other settings to be incredibly generic, and it also just isn't clear what purpose they serve. Wrath isn't quite as cohesive as the old games. Crash 2 had you going to different places, Warped had you going to different time periods. Wrath just has a whole assortment of weird fucking shit, like spooky castles and stuff. If there is one thing I can say I absolutely love about the Wrath of Cortex, it would be the soundtrack. It can be horribly out of place at times, given how incredibly underwhelming this game looks and plays, but I'll be perfectly honest, the music is just so amazing that I don't even care. All of the compositions are just super fucking layered. Like, the instrumentation is just otherworldly. I want to be cool and analyze it for you guys, but whenever I listen to this shit, I just forget how to use words. Just listen to the percussion on Seashell Shenanigans, or that fucking slick bass on Bonsai Bonsai, or everything about Medieval Madness, or the woodwinds on Jungle Rumble, the tempo change in Gold Rush, the climax of Ghost Town, all that shit that's building up at the end, the agonizingly slow build-up of Droid Void, or the fact that Coral Canyon is in a fucking 5/4 time signature? Bruh, this game's music is like way too good. Please, for the love of God, people at Activision, get these composers to come back. Anyways, with all that in mind, I would put Wrath of Cortex in the C tier.
But you said never to
I know what I said!
Yes, believe it or not, there are actually things I quite admire about Wrath of Cortex, but ultimately, it's just not really a good game. Like, it's fine enough, I suppose, it just doesn't hold up at all to the original games. Rather than feeling like a logical next step for Crash Bandicoot, this game just feels incredibly derivative of the old games. It adds basically fucking nothing to the formula. The game has little moments here and there, and if you ask me, the music is so good it almost makes the game worth playing. Keyword being almost. I think it rests comfortably in the C tier. Now on to the next game. Yeah, this Crash Bandicoot game? It's not good. Video games can make me fucking angry sometimes. Like, honestly, dude, there are games that I like that make me fucking angry sometimes. It happens fairly often. I'm a complete psychopath. But very few games have ever made me, like, seriously upset. And when I say upset, I don't mean to say hysterical or depressed. Just bummed out. Like, ruin my fucking day, you know? Crash Twinsanity is one of those few games. Crash Twinsanity is ludicrously unfinished. It genuinely surprises me that the game was released like this, and what surprises me more is the fact that people like it. I just can't wrap my head around why. I mean, I kinda have an idea, since I did like the game when I was a child, and I actually spoke highly of the game back during the good old Stimpyland days, but I said a lot of fucking retarded bullshit that didn't make any sense back then. So if someone likes Twinsanity, it must mean one of two things. 1. They're retarded. 2. They're a little baby boy that doesn't know any better, so hopefully I don't have to explain that I don't genuinely mean this. It's called hyperbole, folks.
You should try it sometime.
I'm not here to change your mind. If you like Twinsanity, keep at it. I just do not agree with basically anything positive people say about this game, and I'm going to make my case as to why that is. So I'm going to start by saying something that will come as a surprise to absolutely nobody. Crash Twinsanity is loaded with glitches. Now, the question I want to answer is, how problematic is this exactly? Well, you can beat Twinsanity in minutes. I'd like to stop there and say, haha, gotcha, except that it wouldn't really be fair to roast Twinsanity over that. Or it would, but then I couldn't give games like Spyro 2 a pass. For those curious, I'd consider Spyro 2 to be somewhere between A and B tier. And spoilers, but I intend to rank Twinsanity much lower. I mentioned Spyro 2 because that game can also be beaten in around 10 minutes. The any % speedrun world record is just under 8 minutes. Jak and Daxter, a game I'd consider to be an easy S tier, also has some pretty amazing glitches that have cut down the speedrun time in that game considerably. In defense of Jak and Spyro, I think you need to go out of your way to encounter glitches in those games. Many of Spyro 2's sequence breaks are thanks to the double jump glitch, a glitch that is very easy to perform but in my opinion requires a series of inputs that's pretty unintuitive. After all, I played the game for many years without knowing about the double jump glitch. And as far as Jak goes, I still have absolutely no idea how people discovered the fire canyon and lava tube skips. It's definitely not something a casual player would do by accident. This is what separates these games from something like Shadow the Hedgehog, where the glitches are constantly getting in your way. Twinsanity fans would likely say something similar, that you don't really encounter glitches unless you go out of your way to find them. Do I agree? Well, yes and no. It's a little complicated. True, you won't really ever encounter the various skips used in speedrunning, like the trick to run on the roof of Antagony. However, that isn't to say that you really need to go out of your way to find glitches. When I was very little, I remember discovering a glitch by accident, by jumping on the projectile Cortex fires during his first boss fight. Of course, when I was little, I thought this was the coolest thing ever and ended up spending more time doing that than I did actually playing the game. I was more intrinsically motivated back then. Check out my last video for deets on that, it's a really good video and you should watch it right fucking now, don't fucking wait! But anyway, I'm not really gonna roast Twinsanity over that either. While glitches weren't really too much of a problem for me, I was having constant run-ins with the game's tremendous lack of polish. Incidents that affected gameplay. I think what I find more infuriating than anything else is how you can walk into unskippable story cutscenes that you have already watched. I know from personal experience when I was younger I played Boiler Room Doom twice because, while exploring, I walked into the cutscene that plays before you enter the level, and I assumed that I would have to play the level again. I think because, in a more polished game, this cutscene is telling the player that it's time to play this level. Because what else could this cutscene possibly convey? The in-game cutscenes in their entirety are just so insanely jank. They're animated badly, you can easily break them, they don't have any sound effects or original music, and worst of all, they're unskippable. I probably wouldn't mind them being unskippable if it weren't for the fact that, if you die before a cutscene, you'll often be forced to re-watch that cutscene. And of course, sometimes you don't even need to die, you can just walk into a cutscene after you've already watched it and be forced to watch it again. Interestingly, in some of the earlier builds of the game, like the E3 2004 demo, you could actually skip any cutscene. And for whatever reason, this was actually removed in the final game. I have no idea where I heard this, so for all I know it's complete bullshit. But I remember hearing that skipping cutscenes could cause glitches to happen, and rather than fix the glitches, they just prevented you from skipping cutscenes at all. Perhaps this is not true, but I can't really think of any other reason they'd prevent you from skipping cutscenes unless they thought that Cortex farting cutscene was just so absolutely hilarious that it was just totally imperative that everybody saw it. I think one of the funniest instances of this game's amazing lack of polish is how touching a boss's dead corpse will kill you and force you to replay the long, boring boss again. How on earth was this left in the final game? I'm so confused. Now, there is something I do actually have to acknowledge about the glitches. While, in my opinion, they can hinder casual play of the game, they do have an unintended positive effect on the game. That effect would be the game's potential for speedrunning. Crash Twinsanity is a very popular game for speedrunning, and for good reason. The game's abundant glitches is something that the community has come to really admire. New discoveries are constantly being made, the game is honestly just that glitchy. Speedrunners wouldn't consider this a downside at all, and honestly, I won't even lie, Twinsanity speedruns are pretty entertaining. My friend the Red Hot BR has been speedrunning the game again on his Twitch recently, and it's fucking dope. I'm not even gonna argue. I probably won't ever speedrun the game myself, but if that's one of the things that attracts you to this game, I can't even blame you at all. But just because I'll concede that it's a good speedrunning game, does that mean I think it's a good game overall? Some people would say yes, some people would say no. I'm one of the people that would say no. In fact, I'd actually like to defer to a video by ASOMSouse called Is Melee a Good Game? Melee is an intense, thrilling experience and is one of the most mechanically deep fighting games of all time, if played under a very specific rule set, using very specific techniques. If you're not willing to put in the hours of practice needed to compete at a competent level, what you're left with is a kind of mediocre party game with terrible single-player content. So, spoiler alert, he ultimately concludes the video by saying no. The competitive aspect of Melee is just one small part of Melee as a whole, and most of Melee is just not very great. The competitive scene is a beautiful oasis in a desert of mediocrity. This is all totally subjective, and just varies from person to person based on their definition. Some people would say Melee is a good game on the grounds of its competitive potential, and some people would say Twinsanity is a good game for similar reasons. And if you happen to think that way, that's totally fine. But me personally, I consider speedrun potential to be supplemental, not fundamental. In my eyes, it can make an already good game even better, but cannot redeem a game on its own. And obviously, in my opinion, I do not think highly of Twinsanity's casual playthrough experience at all. You remember those little moments in the original games that I loved? Crash's return to the wardroom and how that was butchered in Wrath of Cortex? Well, Twinsanity fails harder on this front than Wrath of Cortex ever could have hoped to. If you'll permit me to make just another one of these long-winded comparisons, what happens in the original Crash games when you get 3 masks? You become invincible, no shit, but it's more than just that. Crash jumps up in the air, the music, which is typically pretty chill, suddenly gets very fast-paced. As you run through the level, all the enemies and crates around you violently explode. It's such an awesome, cathartic moment that provides a nice change of pace. Naughty Dog was well aware of this, as, at the end of Bug Light, the final level in the original trilogy, they just give you 3 masks and let you loose on a ton of nitros. It's such an amazing moment that works so well because you've just got total control over it. It just blends seamlessly into what you're doing. This isn't some cutscene the game forces on you. It's something you've totally earned. It's these kinds of details that make Crash special. Compare Crash to Sonic Adventure. What does invincibility look like in that game? He glows a bit and the music changes. That's it. It's lame. So what does Twinsanity offer?
Oh, nothing happened.
Yeah, Aku Aku just parks his ass on your face, you get an ugly orange particle effect around you, the music doesn't change, and the best part, it literally doesn't even fucking work! It doesn't kill enemies, it doesn't break crates, and sometimes it just blatantly doesn't even protect you. The way these moments are butchered is one of the reasons I just can't stand this game. Now, I seriously doubt that anybody at Traveler's Tales looked at this and thought it was acceptable. I seriously doubt anybody at Traveler's Tales wanted the game to be released like this. Crash Twinsanity was quite infamously rushed. For as contemptible as I find this game, I can't help but feel really bad for everyone that worked on it. This does lead me into one of the other major points defenders of this game bring up, its potential. These people would say, yes, the game, as it exists currently, is not good. But clearly Traveler's Tales were on the right track, surely this game had the potential to be good. I take issue with this sentiment for 2 reasons. One is that I don't believe in pulling punches on a game because it could have been good. If I'm being nice, I'd say it's deserving of praise, but only very slightly. People praise Crash Twinsanity for its greater focus on characters and story. In theory, I appreciate this as well. But in practice, you're left with some of the most hilariously fucking terrible storytelling I've ever seen. Like, okay, who remembers that Crash just lands on a block of ice in the middle of the ocean, for some reason, and Entropy and Embryo, characters that are established allies, I guess, are just hanging out there for some fucking reason. Then they ask Crash a question? Because that makes sense. Then Embryo turns into a frog, because that's definitely an established thing I've seen him do. Nothing out of the ordinary here. Yeah, in theory, Engine being abandoned by Cortex and forming a pirate crew is really cool. But in practice, we get this. Oh! I feel like any discussion about Crash Twinsanity, whether that be its story or its mechanics, can quickly degenerate into wild speculation. I think people's obsession with the idea of what Crash Twinsanity could have become has blinded them to what it actually is, a buggy, unfinished mess with a shallow and completely nonsensical story. As far as respecting the origins of your series go, if Sonic Mania is Breaking Bad, then Crash Twinsanity is 911 Lone Star. Now, in defense of the people who make this argument, I do think that if Twinsanity had lived up to more of its potential, it would have probably made an alright game, which is more than I can say for something like Shadow or Sonic 06. Even if those latter 2 games weren't ungodly buggy piles of trash, they'd still be absolutely fucking terrible for a myriad of other reasons. I couldn't say the same about Twinsanity. But anyway, this leads me into my second issue with that sentiment, is just how good Crash Twinsanity could have potentially been. People say that if this game was really polished and fleshed out, it could have been as good or better than the original games. And I'm sorry, but I just do not agree at all. Perhaps this is a testament to just how unfinished Crash Twinsanity really is, but there is not enough here to convince me that this game is worth the hype. Based on what's been released, what we have to work with here, I don't agree that Crash Twinsanity really feels at all like the logical next step you could take Crash Bandicoot in. To me, it just feels like a massive detour, not too dissimilar from the games developed by Radical Entertainment. And at least fans of those games are honest about how fucking bizarre they are. Crash Twinsanity randomly has, like, tons of great physics puzzles, and I'm sorry, but I don't know where the precedent was for this in the original games. People praise Twinsanity for its focus on exploration and non-linearity. This by itself is a bit of a departure from the original games, but doesn't have to be a bad thing at all. I just don't agree at all with the execution. I think Jak and Daxter's level design serves as a good point of comparison. Also, I do have to say this, Jak and Daxter feels much more like an evolution of the Crash formula than any of the weird projects to come out of the PS2 era. Jak and Daxter's level design is so amazing because of how it seamlessly blends exploration and linear platforming. As Nova Canoe, yes him again, explains in his analysis of Jak and Daxter, in any given level there may be 3 different paths from point A to point B, and each of those paths has all the elements of a fully fleshed out Crash level. If you ask me, it's almost like you took multiple Crash levels and crunched them together and have them weaving in and out of each other. It's really cool. Crash Twinsanity has linear platforming, and it has exploration, but you're only ever really doing one of those things at a time. I think I need to share some examples because I'm having trouble explaining this. For example, when you get to the Iceberg Lab, you're unleashed on this massive area where you can explore. Well, first of all, I don't really appreciate how humongous this area is, because you've just got a ton of empty space that adds time between you and one of the multiple, isolated, and lazy get-around-the Nitro puzzles. Then, once you enter the cave to start Ice Climb, any and all exploration comes to an immediate halt, and it's just a straight shot to the next objective. The same can be said of the Academy of Evil and Classroom Chaos now that I think about it. I think the best levels in the game are actually the very first 2. Aside from the annoying Aku Aku cutscene which has been etched into my fucking brain, the opening area is actually pretty nice. You've got lots of room to explore and little optional areas to look around in, but it's also concise. You aren't just covering ground, you're always wandering into meaningful gameplay. Jungle Bungle would be a pretty fantastic level if it weren't for the obnoxious fucking tutorial that has absolutely no business being here whatsoever. This is a linear level, but there are plenty of pockets the player can explore if they want to. In an ideal world, every level of Twinsanity would be like this. Cavern Catastrophe and Totem Hokum do feature a little bit of this as well, but as Twinsanity goes on, these optional areas become less and less abundant, until you get to the wide open areas designed explicitly for them. I also find Crash's controls to be horribly unsatisfying. Just like Wrath of Cortex, a lot of the nuances in the controls are gone. People seem to like it, and I get why, it's totally fine, but Crash's slide jump just feels absolutely awful to me. And his controls are just so weightless. Like in Wrath of Cortex, this leads to platforming that is just incredibly unsatisfying and mindless. He isn't quite as floaty as he was in Wrath of Cortex, and the game can still manage to be a little challenging. The controls are okay enough, I suppose, but they're definitely not praiseworthy. Naughty Dog proved with Crash, and especially Jak and Daxter, that having a character that is just fun to run around in circles with really goes a long way. I can't say Twinsanity ever made me feel the same way. And as for all of the other gameplay styles the game dabbles in, Nina is, like, fine enough, I guess. I, just played this game and forgot how she controls, which is probably not a good sign. The Roller Brawl feels no more or less satisfying than the Atmosphere, and I was amazed by how bad Cortex and the Humiliscate felt. The last thing I feel the need to mention about this game, and I'm gonna piss people off with this, but it's the music, which is one of the fucking worst things I've ever heard in my entire goddamn life. This game's music is the kind of thing you would play for someone if you were trying to piss them off. I don't think I've ever heard music more irritating, obnoxious, and just plain unlikable than this, like really. I'll be honest, I really don't want to talk about it. It's just fucking horrendous in every conceivable way. And every time I think about it, I get, upset. It's a fucking acapella for some reason. Why? Why, though? But, why? This is honestly the Corey Feldman of video game soundtracks. You know what? Let's just stop talking about it for fuck's sake. I really don't want to continue. It's fucking terrible. Now that I think about it, I think the music demonstrates better than anything else why I really don't agree with the idea that Twinsanity was just brimming with potential. This soundtrack just gets absolutely everything wrong. And if this soundtrack was their trajectory for the style of this game, then I don't want to see it ever get finished. And now that we ripped that band-aid off, it's time for me to rank this game. I'm going to put Twinsanity in the D tier. Earlier versions of this list actually had it in the F tier, but for as much as I fucking despise basically everything about this game, I can't in good conscience put it in the same tier as something like Sonic 06. And besides, there are very, very faint glimmers of a good game somewhere in there. I just don't know where they are. If I had a D- or maybe an F+ tier, I'd put it in there. F plus would probably be the best place for it. Now, earlier when I described F-tier games, I used Shadow the Hedgehog as an example, and how that game destroyed Sonic's reputation. Looking at Crash Bandicoot now, he actually seems to be doing pretty good, so Twinsanity obviously didn't destroy the series' reputation. However, I do actually think Twinsanity did have long-lasting, damaging effects on the series. Case in point, Twinsanity is the game where Crash lost any and all chill he once had. In the original games, Crash's face rested in a nice neutral position. That way, whenever he smiled, I really think it meant something. So many memorable expressions came from these games, like the face he makes on the result screen of Crash 1 or in the warp room of Crash 2. Crash Twinsanity plasters a big fucking grimace on Crash's face that never fucking goes away. Just keep smiling all the time, never go off brand. And this ugly grimace has stuck with him throughout the Radical games. There's even hints of it in Insane Trilogy. It's not just this either. I think a lot of the obnoxious humor that people, including me, rightly criticize the Radical entertainment games for started here. A lot of those people seem to give this one a pass though, and I really don't get it. Now with all that said and done, if you're a Crash Twinsanity fan, thank you for putting up with my rant. It was probably frustrating to listen to. So now you know how I feel.
Oh God, where do I start with you pussy-ass crybaby gamers? Good God, man.
Okay, really quick, right off the bat. Apologies for the horrible quality of this footage. Unfortunately, Crash of the Titans happens to suffer from some very bad porting. For most of my life, I owned and played this game on the PS2, but for my most recent playthrough, I unfortunately had to play on my 360 copy. The Xbox 360 version of Crash of the Titans adds a lot of ugly, dizzying visual effects that bring the frame rate to an absolute crawl. So apologies in advance for that. Over the years, Crash of the Titans has gone down as a very polarizing game. People either love it or hate it. I've seen very little in between. Personally, I've been on both sides of the aisle. Even as recent as a year ago, I was singing its praises on the Stimpyland commentaries. But after my most recent playthrough, I gotta be honest, I really don't like this game that much.
I don't love you anymore.
But I can't say that I really hate it either, and it was absolutely heavenly to play after Twinsanity. Crash of the Titans is a massive detour from the original games. I'd say it's about as unrelated as Twinsanity, maybe a little more. The change in presentation is what often gets the loudest reaction, specifically the new character designs. Let's address that elephant in the room really quick. These designs range from being kinda decent to impressively bad. Crash's redesign might be the worst of the bunch, sadly. He's lost the gloves, which doesn't bother me a ton, but he also has these edgy-looking tribal tattoos that I don't care for. Honestly, what bothers me more than anything else is just how messed up his proportions are. He's really puny for some reason. Most of the cast have been downgraded, unfortunately. I think this is the absolute worst Coco has ever looked, and Crunch plays such a minor role I wonder why on earth he was even redesigned at all. I don't like Engine's weird gray color palette, and I don't think I've ever heard anyone say anything positive about Tiny, and I have nothing else to add to that. As for all the other designs in the game, I actually kinda like them. By other designs, I'm referring to the monster and enemy designs. Can't say I'm absolutely in love with them, but I don't think they're half bad. And if there's one thing I really admire about the game's visuals, it would be the environmental art direction. In fact, I would go so far as to say that Titans has the best looking environments since the original trilogy. The sheer scale of this game never ceases to be impressive to me. Like, for some reason, everything in this game is absolutely fucking massive. This game has some great atmosphere. My favorite locations would probably be Episode 4, Temple of Zoom, Episode 14, Family Tree, and Episode 15, Calamityville Horror, the lattermost example being, in my opinion, one of the best looking levels in the entire franchise. So that's probably my favorite thing about this game. My least favorite thing about this game, and really all of Radical's games, is how the Crash cast was shrunk down considerably. This started back in Tag Team Racing. The cast was shrunk down to be the Bandicoots, the Cortexes, and the weird Radical Entertainment OCs. Just imagine if, instead of getting to control a bunch of admittedly cool-looking monsters, you got to fight and then take control of characters like Dingodile or Koala Kong. It was just a massive missed opportunity in my opinion. Radical was definitely very passionate about the series, but also couldn't resist the urge to shove in their own ideas, which would often undermine the foundations established in previous games. As far as the music in the game goes, I find it to be very hit or miss. I happen to really like Turf's Up, Green Bowl Groove, and Barbecue Bash. They seem to be pretty unanimously loved, even by people that don't like this game, so I guess that isn't shocking. Preposterous Preamble and A New Hop are some of my favorite songs in the entire series. Seriously, that low, grimy synth on A New Hop, it sounds like a fucking Death Grip song. Most of the other music in this game I find to be really forgettable. A part of me actually does like some of the slower tracks in this game, such as the song that plays during Calamityville Horror. It's mostly just eerie noise with some sparse strings. I can admire the restraint in the music here. It serves as a nice backing to let the game's atmosphere do the talking. It isn't rolling around on the floor, throwing a temper tantrum, and loudly begging for your attention 100% of the time the way Twinsanity's music did. And that about rounds out my discussion of the presentation of Crash of the Titans. As for the game's mechanics, I find these to be fairly questionable as well. For some reason, the game is a beat-em-up, which I don't really understand. There was never a precedent for this greater focus on combat. This is actually something Twinsanity ever so slightly dabbled in a bit as well, and I found it just as confusing there. So let's say I'm pretty satisfied to see Crash 4 ditch this idea. I think I need to back up a bit though. Titan's two primary modes of play are platforming and combat. The platforming in Titans feels, well, not good. Titans does finally reintroduce some momentum in Crash's jump, which gives it some much needed weight, but it's a little too restrictive. I'm struggling to find the exact words I'm looking for, so apologies if this doesn't make any fucking sense. But I feel like when Crash leaves the ground, he feels totally locked in that direction. He can't make any turn or slight adjustment in the air. It seemed Radical were aware of this, so they gave Crash a hover move that also doubles as an attack that can reflect projectiles. The hover move makes platforming in Crash of the Titans an absolute joke. Another major problem with Titans platforming is one that leads me into my discussion about the combat. The mutants cannot jump, and the mutants are the main attraction to this game's combat. Titan's two primary modes of play, combat and platforming, almost never intersect. This leads to a lot of the awkward, segmented level design I complained about in Twinsanity. You're put into the designated exploration area, then you cross a gate and enter the designated platforming area. Titans has the exact same issue, but with combat instead of exploration. The fact that the levels are so fucking giant makes for some great visuals, but also makes for some tedious platforming, which is so incredibly mindless that I hesitate to call it platforming at all. And all this platforming comes to a grinding halt when you enter an arena. The fact that your mutants can't jump means they can't join you in the platforming sections, usually requiring you to abandon them. The platforming in Titans isn't good. So does the quality of the combat at least make up for this?
No.
I don't think the combat is too bad at all, I just find it very lackluster. Titans does feature a couple of unique combos, but simply mashing square is almost always a better option. Moves like the gyro jackhammer are just completely goddamn pointless. You have a heavy attack you can perform with the triangle button. The move is just too slow to make me ever want to use it over the light attack, which by comparison is much quicker. The only other function the heavy attack really serves is breaking through enemy guards, and to do this you need to slowly charge the already slow move. It's just incredibly unpleasant to use. The only useful combo is the one you learn fairly late into the game, the chin tickler, performed with square, square, triangle. The third attack is quick, breaks through enemy blocks, and ends quickly, allowing you to easily start the combo over. This move is highly useful, and in my opinion actually feels rewarding to pull off. I find it much more satisfying to time my presses of square and triangle rather than just repeatedly tap one button until all the enemies are dead. The one other major attack Crash has at his disposal is his iconic spin attack, which you first need to unlock, only for it to have lots of limitations on it. While I don't like having to unlock the spin, I actually do agree with the idea that the spin needs a limitation in a game like this. I agree with that idea, just not the execution. After spinning for too long, Crash will become dizzy and will be completely vulnerable for like 5 seconds. The risk of letting your spin get out of control always outweighs the potential upside it could have. When I last played the game, I remember trying to count my presses of square and seeing how many it took for my spin to run out. That was until I realized I could just mash square without spinning and get the exact same result. The game should either have a warning of when you're going to spin out, or just remove the period of Crash being dizzy. So instead he's forced to spin out and has to just wait half a second before initiating another one, like how it worked in all the games prior to this one. As for the mutants, I find them to be highly variable in just how fun they are. Many of the mutants sadly suffer from the same limited controls as Crash. Take the Spike, which is the first mutant you control. It has a light attack that is fast, does good damage, and is easy to perform. He has a heavy attack that has a long startup with a low reward. Then he has a super attack, which is so slow you are almost guaranteed to get hit during the move's long startup. There is a small set of archetypes that most of the mutants fall into. Big guys like the Spike, Sludge, or Ratsicle, weaker but quicker mutants that fire ranged attacks, of which there are 3 that are almost completely identical. You kinda get the idea. It would be easier for me to talk about the few I actually found to be unique. Fighting the Sludge as Crash is an absolute nightmare, and I will have more to say about that in a bit. But as for playing as the Sludge himself, he's pretty unique. You can cancel his attacks almost immediately after they come out into a stance that puts him in the ground. While in the ground, you can press the square button to do a fast uppercut that is super satisfying to pull off, and it just looks ridiculously cool. For once, it's more optimal to actually perform a stylish combo instead of just mashing square. The Rhino Roller is normally really slow and cumbersome to use, but using his super attack you can roll around like an absolute madman. Sure, it's kind of mindless, but it's just so incredibly cathartic and satisfying to pull off. I wish we got more mutants like this instead of the basic reskins we got, like the Ratsicle or Electric. Lastly, the Scorporilla seems kind of boring until you discover one of her unique attacks. By dropping your guard and immediately pressing square, she'll unleash a very fast, powerful jab straight forward which can combo directly into her regular light attack. It's ridiculously overpowered and kinda bad for how unbalanced it is, but it's just so fun to pull off that I don't even care. If there's one thing I really enjoy in this game, it's working your way up the food chain of mutants. Starting with a smaller mutant, using it to control a bigger mutant, and using that bigger mutant to control an even bigger mutant. It feels incredibly satisfying to take over the Scorporilla and use it to one-shot enemies that previously gave you trouble. These sorts of moments are what I missed so much about the original trilogy. These were the things that Wrath of Twinsanity butchered so hard, and I'm really glad that they return here in some capacity. I'd go so far as to say that it almost makes the game worth playing, but sadly not quite. Now remember how I praised the game for its polish? Wait, what's that? I didn't actually use the word polish and just thought I did and didn't feel like going back and changing the script? Yeah, exactly, the game's polish, as I mentioned before. Visually, this game is very polished, but mechanically, this game has some serious fucking jank. I happened to play and 100% complete the game on the hardest difficulty, which I would not recommend at all. There were many sections I felt like I had exploited rather than triumphed over, and I felt like I had to exploit them to get past. This infamous arena with multiple sludges and a Scorporilla was so ludicrously unfair I almost gave up. The sludges can dive into the ground to completely avoid you. Their uppercut attack leaves you knocked down for so long that they regenerate most of the damage you dealt to them. And while you're trying to fight one, there's another one that won't get off your fucking ass. The worst section in the game by far, however, is Uka Uka's boss fight. This boss fight is very clearly made arbitrarily difficult by the amount of enemies that swarm you, and the fact that he can total any mutant you control with one attack, forcing you to start the long, tedious process of trying to control a mutant over again. I actually couldn't get past this section like I wanted to. I had to go back to a previous level to grind on the battlers. If you control a certain number of mutants, you'll unlock a costume that allows you to stun the enemy in one hit. Hard as I tried to complete this section without this exploit, I just could not do it. 3 hours and many game overs had me totally fed up. It is for this reason that, if you decide you just have to play this game, I would recommend you do it on the easiest difficulty. It gives you a little more room to experiment and play around as, for example, the punishment of letting Crash spin out is much less. So you can make a mistake or two and still live. And sections like the Sludges or Uka Uka are still annoying, but don't feel as ludicrously bullshit as they do on hard. Oh yeah, and unskippable cutscenes make their return from Twinsanity, which in my opinion greatly hinders the replayability of this game. I know there have been times in the past where I've thought about playing Titans and ultimately turned it down because I was in the mood for something I could quickly start up, without having to watch that unfunny opening cutscene again. And now I've run out of things to talk about. I'm putting the game in C tier. I definitely think this game had more going for it than Twinsanity, but it was sadly kind of botched in execution. I don't really despise this game at all, however. If I had to review the game in one syllable, that syllable would be... eh.
Green penis. Wait, that's terrible. I quit.
Mind Over Mutant is a game that, in my opinion, undeservedly gets a really bad rap. Why that is, I'm not entirely sure. Perhaps it's because it's a sequel to Titans which, as I have hopefully established, had many legitimate things to not like about it. Maybe it was just the absolutely hideous box art which doesn't even resemble the game at all. I'm not really sure. A lot of people, even people that like Titans, just tend to write Mind Over Mutant off. You can even hear me doing this as recently as a year ago. Well, in the year that's passed, I've actually played the game again, multiple times over, and have had plenty of time to digest it. I actually like the game quite a bit. I definitely say it's better than Titans, but I wouldn't quite call it a good game, although it has definitely come the closest by far to any of the games I've previously covered. In terms of presentation, I don't have a ton to add to what I already said about Titans. Crash still has his tribal tattoos, which I could definitely do without, but he's much closer to his old proportions, which makes me happy. I don't much care for the massive fucking grimace that never goes away, but I lay that at the feet of Twinsanity. Fucking sue me. Coco and Crunch look much better than they did in Titans. The masks, Cortex, and Nina are all the same. And Brio is actually back, and I think he looks as great as ever for the very little screen time his model has. That's because he appears almost exclusively in the animated cutscenes. Mind Over Mutant features cutscenes in many different styles of animation, and to be honest, I don't really know how I feel about this anymore. I think it gives the game a lot of character, and I kinda love it for just how bizarre it is. At the same time, not all cutscenes are created equal. I really like the opening cutscene, which is a nice callback to the opening FMV in Titans. I also like the cutscene that formally reintroduces Brio, and there's that weird South Park cutscene where Uka Uka literally calls Crash retarded, which is pretty excellent. All of the other cutscenes range from semi-passable flash animation to some of the fucking ugliest shit I've ever seen in my goddamn life, with Nina's cutscene and the Dragon Ball parody at the end of the game being the worst examples. However, even if all the cutscenes did look good, I think I'd still take a little bit of an issue with this. The original games always had their cutscenes be in-engine. Even Wrath of Cortex feebly attempted to carry the torch on this, to some not-so-stellar results, but at least they tried. I much prefer the original game's approach to cutscenes as opposed to the FMVs in Twinsanity. Nothing feels quite as deflating as seeing the very impressive FMV animation in that game, only to be followed by the pitifully bad in-engine cutscenes. And if you ask me, those cutscenes were more impressive than any of the phony as fuck PS1 FMVs from that era. Sadly, in Mind Over Mutant, the differences are even more jarring, and the game's very few in-engine cutscenes make Crash Twinsanity look like fucking David Lynch. I don't have a whole ton to comment on the story. In my opinion, it is one of the least interesting aspects of these games, and is something that every hack reviewer, including me that one time, can't shake the urge to needlessly dissect. All I really care about is the story told well, and does the story build meaningfully on previously established lore? To answer that first question, in my opinion, not really. To answer the second question, it does, but it could have done more. I'm in agreement with basically everyone that Brio is the best part of this game's story. First of all, I like the fact that the game actually bothers to make a big deal out of the fact that he's back, rather than him just appearing next to Entropy on a block of ice in the middle of the fucking ocean with no dialogue and asking you not to question it. It's really fucking weird, man. Like, what the fuck is going on? He's allied himself with Cortex, but still has a chip on his shoulder for Cortex stealing his inventions, which is a nice callback to their feud in Crash 2. Also, the performance from Maurice LaMarche is absolutely amazing and is easily the most entertaining part of this game. One other little detail in the story I like is Cortex's betrayal of Uka Uka. To me, it serves as another nice callback to Crash 1 and 2, but perhaps I'm the only person that sees it that way. If you'll remember, Uka Uka didn't exist until Warped, and in the opening of that game it's revealed that he was there all along, secretly calling the shots the whole time. Cortex always cowered in fear in Uka Uka's presence. Cortex was always more of a servant than an ally to Uka Uka, and I've always imagined Cortex holding a grudge against this guy for barging in during the third game and ordering him around. Mind Over Mutant confirms this bias of mine, which makes me happy. My only gripe is that I wish more was done with these characters. Imagine if Entropy and Dingodile returned and were given similarly interesting moments to shine. Crash 4 seems to be picking up the slack here, which also makes me happy. Embryo deciding to just leave about 2/3 of the way through makes for a funny gag, but also prematurely starves the game of one of its only interesting characters. Also, why does Uka Uka just vanish from the story after you rescue him? Anyways, if I have to talk about this story for even 5 seconds more, I think I'll kill myself. All you need to know is, I think the story is good, but it could have been a lot better. The environments this time around aren't quite as massive, although I'd consider this a good thing for reasons that will become apparent as I talk about the gameplay. Unfortunately, they're also not quite as detailed or varied as they were in Titans. I still think the game looks great, but it does feel like a bit of a step backward from Titans. The game's music, on the other hand, I think is great and a tremendous improvement. I remember most of the songs individually now, which is something I definitely couldn't say before. Icy Ambush and Gloomy Windswell in particular are some of the franchise's best songs in my opinion. Mechanically is where I think Mind Over Mutant shines far above Titans, although it also introduces some problems of its own. Crash's controls are mostly similar to how they were in Titans. Even though his jumps are probably identical to how they were in Titans, I don't know, they just feel much better here. Perhaps it's the very exaggerated squash and stretch on his jump animation. His jump still feels kinda stiff, but I think the level design is more accommodating this time around, which is perhaps why it didn't bother me that much. The hover move has been turned into a drill attack. I think the lack of a hover move is actually a good thing this time around. It means the platforming in this game actually requires a bit of skill and attention instead of the non-platforming featured in Titans. Also, the hover isn't completely gone. If you hold the button, you can make some very fine adjustments that can save your life if you know what you're doing. The attack itself isn't tremendously useful, but it doesn't really need to be. Besides, I did find some fairly situational uses for the move, like jumping over an enemy's attack and drilling down on them. Crash retains all of the actually useful moves he can unlock in Titans, such as the Chin Tickler, which feels as great as ever. In Titans, Crash could do these dodge rolls by pressing a direction while blocking. I didn't talk about them because I didn't find them to be especially useful. Mind Over Mutant removes these rolls in place of a QTE dodge. You can press triangle to slither behind your opponent, at which point you can press triangle again for an automatic follow-up, or you can wait and manually input your own follow-up, such as the Chin Tickler. Doing your own combo can give you a greater reward at the cost of it not being completely guaranteed to work, like the automatic follow-up. These little moments already meant that I was thinking a little more about the buttons I was pressing, rather than just feverishly mashing square like in Titans. The biggest and best change by far is to Crash's spin. Before I complained that they should give you some warning before Crash becomes dizzy. Well, Mind Over Mutant gives you every warning. An icon appears above Crash's head, a particle effect forms around him, and he makes a sound. In Mind Over Mutant, rather than having to spin the stick and press the button, all you need to do is spin the stick. This can seem like a downgrade, having to stop in place and spin the left analog stick, until you realize that you can actually use the right analog stick. This was something I didn't know about until my more recent playthroughs from a few months ago, and when I started to use it, it felt so good. Honestly, I'm kind of annoyed the game doesn't tell you this. I remember talking to someone about this, actually. They said the spin in Mind Over Mutant felt terrible. I then told them that they could use the right analog stick to spin, so you could be moving with the left analog stick and initiate a spin with the right analog stick, while you're moving. And this person later reported back to me that it felt amazing. Mind Over Mutant actually features very few new mutants. In fact, basically all of them except for 2 are returning from Titans. However, all of the mutants here are fairly unique as opposed to Titans where they fit into a small set of categories. Mind Over Mutant definitely prioritizes quality over quantity. First off, there are 2 major improvements over Titans. One is that you can store your mutants. This is almost universal between the mutants. The really big ones can't be pocketed, which I understand completely. Both from a lore perspective of them probably taking too much energy or some bullshit for Aku Aku to store, and also from a mechanical standpoint, as taking out a Scorporilla that can one-shot anything during what is supposed to be a challenging boss fight would definitely hurt the game's challenge. But this is honestly one of the best improvements, and I'm amazed that I didn't think of it sooner. Another great improvement is that all of the mutants can now jump. This means that, finally, the platforming and combat can work together. For example, suppose you're fighting a Scorporilla. In both games, her super attack was a giant shockwave that would travel across the ground. it's totally unblockable, so if you were controlling a mutant when she did the move, you just had to eat shit and find another mutant to control. But in Mind Over Mutant, you can just jump over the shockwave. In fact, afterwards she's vulnerable, which allows you to do a combo of your own. I actually did encounter this the last time I played. I didn't even think about doing it either, it just occurred to me in that moment and I just did it, and it felt super satisfying, and was exactly the kind of thing that was missing in Crash of the Titans. A lot of the combos I liked in Titans have returned. The uppercut puts him in the air, which allows him to do his aerial attack, turning the 3-hit combo into a 4-hit combo. The Ratsicle has a unique combo. By just mashing square, he'll do the same 3-hit combo he always did. However, if you pause after the second attack, you can then do 4 quick attacks followed by a heavy attack. It's just another subtle detail that rewards patience and timing as opposed to just frantically mashing square. Now, is there more that could be done to improve the combat? Absolutely. Combat with the Rhino Roller, for example, feels awful. Although I did notice that you can stop the Rhino Roller in place by holding the block button. Then, while the block button is held down, you can press triangle. He'll do a quick dash and immediately stop after it finishes. I don't know if this was intended, my guess is probably not because the animation looks really fucking stupid, but it did make the Rhino Roller much less tedious to use. Still can't say I enjoyed it all that much. The Stench has an annoying reloading animation that can't be skipped. It will always happen after a certain number of shots. I think it takes about 6. There's no display of how many shots you've fired or any way to manually reload, at least not that I'm aware of. It was annoying enough that I always avoided using him if I was able. Lastly, there's the TK. The primary use of this mutant is for platforming and puzzle solving, which is good because the combat with this thing felt absolutely terrible. Otherwise, I just have mostly positive things to say. I guess I could point out that I think there were some missed opportunities. I imagine the Battler would have been more unique and fun if he was given some kind of aerial combo, seeing as how, he has wings and all. Combat can actually be pretty fun in Mind Over Mutant, and the platforming feels decent. However, the game has a major problem with backtracking. At least, people call it backtracking. I call it absolutely bullshit padding that only exists to arbitrarily extend the length of the game. Backtracking doesn't have to be absolutely terrible. Jak and Daxter features only one instance of backtracking that is absolutely required. The other instance where the game may expect you to backtrack, opening a blue eco-vent in Sentinel Beach, can be avoided by playing the Forbidden Jungle first. Spyro 2 features good and bad backtracking. Bad backtracking arbitrarily gates items behind stupid abilities like learning to climb or learning to use the cumbersome head bash move. All it does is guarantee you'll have to play the same level twice in a row. It's lame as fuck. An example of good backtracking is in Aquaria Towers. As you navigate around the level, you slowly raise the water level. Eventually, you'll fill the entire level up to the very top with water, and it opens up new paths. Even though you're exploring the same area twice, the means by which you're doing the exploring have changed. Mind Over Mutant features stupid padding, where all you're doing is just covering the exact same ground twice. Basically, nothing has changed. Maybe there's like some more enemies or something, but that's literally it. I'm stealing this, again, from Nova Canoe's analysis of Jak 2, but the best way to describe Mind Over Mutant's padding is like this. Imagine if you were playing Super Mario Bros. And, in between every level, you had to play level 1-1 again. You'd get sick of it pretty fucking quickly. And this is exactly what the padding feels like in Mind Over Mutant. It actually feels worse, as Mind Over Mutant expects you to go backwards through levels that were very clearly designed for you to traverse forwards through. What makes this so infuriating is that it didn't need to be like this. Even Twinsanity of all games had the decency to include shortcuts to previously explored areas. What makes this even more infuriating is, all the elements needed to foster the meaningful sort of backtracking I mentioned in Aquaria Towers are already here. It's extremely easy to think up a scenario where you're forced to navigate some difficult gauntlet with many tough enemies, only to find a large enemy like the Yuctopus at the end. Then, being tasked to travel backwards with the Yuctopus, now being able to easily handle all the enemies that previously gave you trouble, flicking away enemies that used to tower over you. Instead, you're just doing the exact same thing you've already done over again, not being tested on or learning anything in the process. And it's apparent that the only reason this was done was to pad out the game. It's not like they had set out to remove loading screens the way Jak and Daxter did. First of all, that still shouldn't have prevented them from including shortcuts to previously explored areas. Also, the game blatantly admits that it's unnecessary, as the game will randomly teleport you to the next place you need to be at one point. Once you free Uka Uka, 3 teleporters are set up that will let you teleport to previously explored areas. It's annoying that this was done so late in the game, and was only done to speed up a cheap fetch quest. It's such a shame because this absolutely did not need to be an issue. I don't think the backtracking is so bad that you'll spend more than a third of the game doing it. But it's the fact that you're forced to do this at all. It is completely unnecessary. So with all that in mind, I would put Mind Over Mutant in the C tier, above Wrath of Cortex. There are things I like, and things I don't like. The combat is greatly improved over Titans and actually feels pretty good. It isn't exactly the most cerebral beat-em-up ever made, but I don't see how someone could enjoy it any less than Titans. Basically everything the Titans did right, this game did better with very few exceptions. I think the big unfortunate exception is the game's padding. Oh, by the way, I almost forgot to mention, whatever you do not fucking attempt to 100% this game. Like, just don't. If you thought the backtracking was bad before, you have absolutely no fucking idea. Here's a fun challenge for you to try out, if you hate yourself. After you beat the game, try and get a TK into the evil school area. That shit is literally fucking impossible without some stupid ass cheesing and a second controller. It's a ton of headache for literally no fucking reward at all. The 100% playthrough will completely exhaust any and all passion you have for this game. This shit makes Sonic Heroes look like a fucking Dragon Ball FighterZ character trailer. So yeah, the game's padding is a pretty glaring downside and is one of the reasons I have trouble recommending it to people. If you're strictly playing the game any percent and are willing to look past the padding, I think you're left with a really fun game that might honestly be the best quote-unquote mainline Crash game since Naughty Dog. But for now, I feel comfortable putting the game in C tier. If I bothered to include sub-tiers, I'd probably rank this game as a C+. But I didn't, so it can stay here for now. Sane Trilogy is a game that I have trouble ranking. Originally, I spoke very highly of the game, but it has waned on me hard in the 2 years since my commentary on the game. I was pretty late to play Sane Trilogy. I didn't follow any of the hype leading up to the game's release and knew basically nothing about it. I was taking a temporary leave of absence from games. My fucking gamer card was revoked and I was discharged from the gamer corps. That's what happened. So I didn't play it first until a few months after it came out. I had a bit of a delayed reaction to everyone else, let's say. When playing the game for the first time, it was just so cool to see Crash be back after an 8-year hiatus. I know I definitely wasn't the only person that felt this way playing the remake. However, now that Crash is properly back, I think we've all been satiated on the Crash hype and have had time to properly digest this game. So what do I think? Do I still enjoy Sane Trilogy? Well, I do. But I want to make something abundantly clear. That has everything to do with Naughty Dog, and nothing to do with Activision or Vicarious Visions. The only reason, and I mean the only reason this game is good, and this game sold well, is because of Naughty Dog's bedrock. The Crash games are fundamentally good games that will sell, regardless of the package they're in. Sorry if this sounds mean, but I give the new developers zero credit for this game's success. There is one thing I can credit them for, though: managing to screw this game up. In terms of presentation, I think these games look decent at their best and hideous at their worst. I just don't find these graphics nearly as appealing as the impressionistic PS1 visuals. If you're interested in some more detailed explanations as to why that might be, I'll defer to this video about Sane Trilogy by BMask, a video I've mentioned multiple times on this channel. He explains it better than I could ever hope to, so if you notice any of the details I point out and want to know more, such as why they might have been fucked up the way they were, you should definitely check his video out. But yeah, I'm just going to point out some details that really bothered me. The game's biggest problem by far is its lighting being a thing that the original games handled flawlessly. The game's uniquely shitty lighting engine causes a whole host of problems that I don't think any other Crash game before this one has had. This can range from the game being stripped of its dark, moody atmosphere to shit that can negatively affect gameplay, such as characters bleeding into their environment or being less prominent than some background details. I think Generator Room sets a great example of just how hard Sane fails. This was one of my favorite levels on PS1. I absolutely love how moody the lighting is. This level is so dark and threatening for what's supposed to be a kid's game. I love it. And those monitors sprinkled all throughout the level with Cortex's face? Oh, it looks so good. It's just so creepy. I absolutely love it. I've always imagined that Cortex was watching me play this level. But what does Sane offer? Well, I see Cortex finally got around to installing that skylight. Good thing too, because I was afraid I might get a little too much atmosphere in my goo goo gaga jumpy game. Also, the monitors I loved so much have been turned into shitty looking animated GIFs. Seriously, like, how the fuck was this put in the final game? This looks like a fan game. A lot of the little details I made such a big stink about in my analysis of Wrath and Twinsanity are still not present here. So many little moments in between bursts of gameplay that were so satisfying in the original game just suck ass in Sane Trilogy. Here's one of the most hilarious examples: the warp room in Crash 2. In the original game, when you step on the platform to enter the next warp room, Crash just makes this great expression as he sticks his thumb straight up. He sticks out clearly from everything else around him. This is just a simple screenshot, yet it looks so good. But in Sane Trilogy, we get this. Crash has shadows over his fucking eyes for some reason. He's got this virgin open mouth expression, and he's just doing this incredibly flaccid point. Seriously, who on earth thought this looked good? Okay, whatever. I'll be here all day if I try to understand what these fucking potatoes were thinking when they made this fucking shit, so forget it. People might be asking me why I care so much about this stuff. I mean, isn't gameplay more important? Well, in my opinion, Crash is not the most mechanically deep game ever. It never was. The original games are not very deep or complex. What makes Crash better than just another platformer are those aesthetic elements. Take Warped, for instance. You're riding the motorcycle and you hit a ramp. What happens? The engine revs up into that high-pitched scream, Crash reels far back in the motorcycle, and the camera pans down so you can see every frame of that incredibly forceful impact. He just lands like a fucking brick. He slams hard into the ground, causing the screen to shake and emitting a huge shockwave. There's also that incredibly cathartic thud of the motorcycle hitting the ground. The spectacle of that scene is what makes it so fun, and it all happened literally within the span of a few seconds. But in Insane Trilogy, that moment is completely stripped of its character. Wow, really? That's the take we went with? Seriously, did anybody get excited over this? Okay, I promise I'm done now. I won't even get into the fact that the lower half of Crash's body is black here for some reason. Okay, now I'm done for real this time. The thing that bothers me the most about Insane Trilogy's visuals is the missing details. Yeah, some shit is just blatantly fucking missing. I mentioned this earlier, but it needs to be restated. What happened to the islands in the secret warp room? I distinctly remember the first time I saw those islands when playing Crash 2, and I thought it was the coolest fucking thing. It absolutely blew my mind as a kid. I was excited to see them in Insane Trilogy, only to see that they fucking forgot to include them? How? Like, okay, I'm sorry, am I fucking crazy or something? Am I wrong for expecting details like this to carry over to the remake? I don't fucking understand how a game released almost 20 years prior to this one is somehow more detailed. God, this remake is fucking pointless. Okay, so obviously, I think the visuals in this game give me Wrath of Cortex flashbacks, and I'm not giving Vicarious Visions or Activision the benefit of the doubt on this one, like I did with Traveler's Tales. They had absolutely more time, money, and experience than they needed. This game has absolutely no business being as ugly as it is. So does the gameplay at least hold up? Well, yes and no. The level design is still great, but all of that credit goes to Naughty Dog. In fact, most of the positive things I'd say about this game are thanks to Naughty Dog. There are very few things I can give Vicarious Visions credit for, but to their credit there are some. The games do feature some small quality of life changes, with Crash 1 benefiting the most. Autosaving is present in all 3 games, and the Wumpa crates now only take 5 bounces instead of 10, which doesn't sound like a big deal, but it is. Crash 1 no longer has the cumbersome save system or gem requirements, which I imagine will make 100%ing the game much easier for some people, which I am not against. I actually like the way the bonus rounds were implemented a lot. Now, the Brio bonus rounds actually serve a point, and trying to complete those Cortex bonus rounds isn't nearly as anxiety-inducing. I'm not entirely sure why you can't die when trying to collect a colored gem. Like, I've heard all the arguments for why that's the case, and I still find it all kinda arbitrary. Doesn't really bother me at all, because every gem was like this in the original, and I was more than willing to put up with it there, but it just seems kinda random to me. Time trials are also present in Crash 1 and 2 now. I don't really enjoy them, but because they're optional, I don't see any harm in them at all. I feel like people could only positively benefit from their inclusion. If they bother you so much, just don't mess with them. Also, I do have to mention that the plane levels in Warped have been massively improved. Aiming is now much easier thanks to the inclusion of a small reticle, and enemy planes will no longer completely obliterate you in 5 seconds like they could on PS1. As far as improvements goes, that is literally it. I guess they added cutscenes to bosses in Crash 1 or something? Great. Plenty about the original games weren't improved. For starters, Crash's controls feel absolutely awful. There's a whole host of different reasons that people have pointed out, ranging from Crash's lack of momentum to his altered falling speed to the awkward hitboxes on his feet. There's one issue I feel compelled to raise because I haven't really seen anyone talking about it. That issue would be of the dead zones on the analog stick. Huge thanks to Eternal Dahaka and Look for this discovery, by the way. I'm going to keep this explanation very simple, so if you're interested in learning more, I'd recommend you check out Eternal Dahaka's Reddit post and video demonstration, both of which will be linked in the description. So it is extremely common for games with analog sticks to feature dead zones. A dead zone is an area within the analog stick's range that won't be registered as an input. Analog sticks, especially old analog sticks, are flawed. Analog sticks don't really rest at the origin perfectly like they're supposed to. They're always ever so slightly tilted to some degree. Dead zones exist to compensate for these manufacturing limitations. By the way, if you've ever encountered stick drift and wondered what's going on behind the scenes, that's when the tilt becomes so severe that it escapes the dead zone. Anyways, Look and I estimate that the dead zone for Crash 2 on PS1 looks something like this. This red circle is the dead zone and makes up about 40% of the total area. This is fairly standard, and while it could be smaller, I can't say it ever really bothered me personally. If you move anywhere within this area, Crash won't move. The dead zone is a circle, which is the preferred shape for a dead zone. That way, moving the stick 60% upwards puts you at the same speed as moving the stick 60% diagonally down and to the left, or in any direction. This light green area is where Crash walks, and extends out to about 80%. The remaining area is Crash's normal running speed. These aren't perfect, but they feel pretty good in my opinion. The game may, depending on the level, introduce areas on the graph that count as unregistered diagonals, which at their most extreme would look something like this, represented by the blue area. Anywhere in this area is registered as a perfect cardinal direction, so putting the analog stick on any of these points would yield the same result as pressing the D-pad upwards. The areas shown here are comically large. In all likelihood, the actual unregistered diagonals are much smaller. So now that we know what all this stuff means, let's take a look at NST's joke of a graph. Yeah, this is pretty retarded. For some reason, the dead zone is this strange clover shape. Basically, this means that 60% in one direction doesn't necessarily equal 60% in another, which is just bizarre and feels so unnatural. And the size of this thing is excessive as all hell and annoyingly inconsistent depending on the direction you hold. In the diagonals it goes out to a little under 50%, and at the cardinals it goes all the way out to 65%, which is way too fucking big. This puny area right here is your walking speed. If you've ever wondered why it feels fucking impossible to walk in this game, that's why. The rest of the area is the running speed, and the unregistered diagonal areas are also fucking massive for some reason. Personally, this explains many of the control issues I've had. These dead zones are just absolutely ridiculous. People may think I'm being pedantic about the analog stick. They may say, oh, just use the D-pad. Well, to them I say, oh, just play the game on PS1, which honestly isn't a bad idea. But seriously, check out Eternal Tahaka's post if this interests you, and huge thanks to Look for helping me write this section. This game isn't exactly unplayable because of this, far from it, but it does feel noticeably less smooth and natural like the old games. Crash's controls weren't the only area that frustrated me either. I noticed many issues with enemy hitboxes, the most infuriating of which would have to be these turtles. For whatever reason, if you don't jump directly on the pixel on top of them, you'll get hit, somehow. That means that it's almost always preferable to land on them with a spin, except for the many occasions where the game clearly expects you to jump on them. I think of the original Trilogy, Warped had the most room for improvement, with a lot of the alternate gameplay styles in that game just not being very fun. Well, as mentioned previously, I think the plane is improved, but that's about it. The motorcycle is as bad as I remember it being, and the jet ski, which was already tedious to use, is somehow even worse here! In the original game, if you wanted to make a tighter turn, you could hold back in a direction on the D-pad or analog stick. This didn't really save those levels exactly, but they did make them much less frustrating, especially when going after all the boxes or doing the time trials. But yeah, they didn't bother implementing that in Insane Trilogy. Can't say I'm exactly surprised, but I am disappointed nonetheless. So I am struggling when it comes to ranking this game. I'm still not entirely sure where I stand with it. As a game, I think it is good, but as I hope I've established, that is only because the original games are fundamentally good games. Even when put into a crappy, disheveled package, they're still good. As a remake, I fucking despise basically everything about it. I can't say it's the worst remake I've ever seen, we've got good old Rehydrated to congratulate on that one, but that doesn't mean I think it's any good at all. Vicarious Visions and Activision have added absolutely nothing to these games. I will easily play the classics over this crap any day. So now I'm faced with a hard choice. Do I judge this game as a game or a remake? While my temptation was to judge it as a remake and dump it in F tier, I've ultimately decided to judge it as a game on its own. I think the game belongs in the B tier. Yes, that may come as a bit of a shock, seeing as how I've done nothing but complain, but hopefully this gets the idea across that I do think the original games are honestly just that fundamentally good. An incompetent developer could only do so much to screw these games up. If you've played the original games 100 times over and just want to satisfy your own morbid curiosity about how Insane handles it differently, or the old games are just not readily available to you and you're a basic bitch, I mean, good person, that doesn't want to just emulate them, then I'd say the game is worth getting. But I want to make clear that I don't really consider the game to be a totally viable replacement of the originals. In my opinion, the original games are well worth the effort of tracking down and buying over Insane. Oh, and I feel like I should mention, I am absolutely delighted to see Crash 4 ditch these hideous models. Good riddance, you little fucking furry bastard. Anyways, that about does it for my list. We've covered a fair amount of games, a decent to strong 8 of them. I guess I'll give some brief thoughts on Crash 4 because people are probably curious. I don't have a ton to say because I'm not the kind of guy that follows the hypes on games leading up to their release. I kinda just wait for a game to come out and see if it's any good. From the little of what they've shown off that I've bothered to watch, it all looks very promising. For once, it doesn't feel insanely derivative or like some weird bullshit out of left field. It's looking like a pretty natural extension of what made the original game so great. It seems like there will be a greater focus on story, and despite the supposed retcon, they will actually be making many references to Crash's Dark Age, with the excuse of it being an alternate timeline. Am I upset to see a Twinsanity level potentially make a comeback? Nah, not really. In fact, I actually think it can be pretty cool. I just hope I don't ever have to hear that game's fucking terrible music ever again, but whatever, I'm getting off track. It seems like we'll be having a greater focus on characters, which has me really excited. This is what Twinsanity aimed to do and failed, what Titans neglected to do, and what Mind Over Mutant did successfully with one character but didn't go far enough. Finally, it seems like they could get this right. Like Dingodile having a diner in an alternate dimension. Ah, that's great. I guess if there's things that upsets me, it seems like the game will most likely be running at 30, which is fucking lame. Fucking Wrath of Cortex ran at 60, I don't know why this game can't. I can hear some of the arguments being made now, and they're all fucking dumb. You're fucking dumb, shut the fuck up. It doesn't really ruin the game, like at all, but it is pretty fucking lame. I also don't like this cringe-ass marketing, like, this image that claims there will be over 100 levels. I'm pressing X to doubt on that one because mirror mode or whatever bullshit you have planned does not fucking count. Also, I keep hearing that the game won't have microtransactions. That's good. I hope it doesn't have them. They're absolutely terrible. You'd better not be lying, you know, like you were last time. You know, you better not be. Got my eye on you. Anyways, that about does it for this one. Transgenders should be killed. I'm reusing that joke. Also, that was hyperbole. I don't actually think that. Did you like my list? Did you love it? Did you hate it? What would you rate it? Thank you for releasing me. Did you play any of these games? What did you think of them? You're the best, you're the best. MONSTRO, The Snippy Land, Crash Bandicoot, forever.